Last time, we started talking about discernment of spirits. These are these 14 trustworthy principles that St. Ignatius of Loyola came with from his own growth of discernment, of recognizing what was going on interiorly. The handout that I've given you is one that you're going to use this for the foreseeable future. It kind of summarizes all the rules on there. We're actually really only going to be covering the first two rules, but just to point out, so the beginning of that handout, right at the top, you may notice it looks similar to the little one we had last time. So I've got the, what discernment is. Right? We're trying to tell what's going on, the movements within our mind, our heart, becoming aware of them. And then these rules help us to name where they're coming from. Is it just something from me, or is it from the good spirit or the bad spirit? And ultimately, it's to lead us to act, right? We act by accepting what comes from God, from the good spirit, and reject what comes from the enemy. But being able to name and sort through the things going on is sometimes the challenge, as well as, how do I then act upon it? So that's what we talked about last time. Tonight we're going to talk about the first two rules. And along the side there, you may see some numbers. That'll indicate which rules we're talking about. So actually, just in that little first box right there is what we're going to be talking about tonight, the first two rules. So in the rules for discernment, St. Ignatius starts with having us consider the two paths that we can be on in our spiritual life. There's two paths we can have. We're either moving toward God or we're moving away from Him. There's really no middle point. We can't just stay in one spot and not go anywhere. If in our spiritual life we're not moving forward to God, we're probably slipping back down away from Him, right? It's kind of like, if you're swimming, you got to tread water. You got to constantly be moving, otherwise you're going to sink, right? So we don't want to sink away from God, but we want to be moving towards Him. But what he explains in these first two rules is that the good spirit and the bad spirit act differently towards us depending upon which path we're on in our life. So he says that those who are moving away from God are persons who are going from mortal sin to mortal sin, right? So that should make sense, right? If we're going from sin to sin, we're going away from God. And those going toward God, he says, are persons who are going on intensely purifying their sins and rising from good to better in the service of God. Hopefully that makes sense too, right? If we're following God, we're trying to get rid of sins. Notice there, it doesn't say that we don't have any sins at all, right? We're on the path. We are trying to allow Him to purify us from our sins, and we're trying to go from good to better, right? For a lot of us, for some people, maybe almost all of their entirety of their life is about moving towards God. For others, unfortunately, their entire life is moving away from God. For a lot of us, there's probably different areas in our life where we've turned that over to God, and maybe a few areas that are a big struggle for us, where we haven't turned it over yet. So, but since you're here, the course of your life is this desire to go from good to better, right? So that's going to be the course of our life. And it's important to recognize which path we're on, because we'll see that for the good and the bad spirits, God versus the enemy, they act differently depending upon which path we're on, which direction we're going. And so that's what he really gets into in those first two rules. So the very first rule, you'll see there, is for those on the path away from God. So I've got in the handout there, if I'm going from sin to sin, then the bad does something and the good does something, right? So it kind of summarizes it there. So here's the words. So if we're on the path away from God, what is the enemy going to do? What's he going to do? St. Ignatius says, in the persons who go from mortal sin to mortal sin, the enemy will propose to them apparent pleasures, making them imagine sensual delights in order to hold them more and make them grow in their vices and sins. So if I'm going from sin to sin, the bad spirit wants me to stay on that path, right? He wants me on that path away from God. And so he's going to, Ignatius says, lead me to imagine pleasures, to keep me in those habits, those vices and sins, right? If we're on the path away from God, he is going to try to keep us, to make us feel good about the direction we're heading, That sin's not such a big deal. Wouldn't you rather spend time, on your phone rather than praying? You're too tired to pray anyway. You go do that instead, right? You don't really need to go to Mass to be close to God. So those kinds of thoughts, ideas that come into our mind, we can recognize in them the enemy trying to make us feel good. To hold us more, right? That's one of the things he says, to hold us more, right? He's trying to hold us back. Example I gave to the kids are like, out on the football field, if you're trying to run the ball one way, the defense is trying to hold you more back, right, to keep you from going. That's how the enemy works. When we're on that path away from God, he wants to hold us going in that direction, not let us turn around back to God. So that's what the enemy is going to do. Well, the other thing too is to notice that when somebody's far from God, then all those worldly temptations towards sin will seem to be good, will be very attractive to them, right? They don't realize that those things aren't good for them, right? So maybe if we know people that are kind of on that path in their life, that's why they don't see anything to be wrong, because the enemy is influencing them to see that everything's good and fine in their life. But ultimately what happens is that God is also working in them, and they'll find that those things will lose their luster and leave them ultimately dissatisfied. Because in this first rule, what does God do? If we're moving away from him, think about it. He doesn't want us on that path, right? He wants us to turn around back to him. So what is the good spirit going to do? Ignatius says, in the persons who go from mortal sin to mortal sin, the good spirit uses the opposite method, pricking them and biting their consciences through the process of reason. All right. So if we're going from sin to sin, God will sting and bite my conscience, right? So if we're on the wrong path, the enemy tries to make us feel good to keep us on that path. But God will make us feel uncomfortable a bit, right? That sting of our conscience. We don't like the shame that comes from sin, but shame's important because it points out something's wrong with our soul. Just as pain to our body tells us something's wrong with our body, we should check it out. So that's what shame does too. God is pricking and biting our conscience to try to awaken us to something's gone wrong, and so that we can turn around. Go to his physicians in the confessional. All right. So if we're on that path away from God, he's working to try to get us back on track, right? You miss Mass. You need to go to confession. Tell the truth. I created you for so much more than this. So notice that when we're far from God, he's not going to allow us just to feel good in that case. And that's why there's an experience of emptiness, of discontent that will be behind what's going on there. Our hearts will be restless, that there's something missing. Because the only thing that will truly make us happy is God himself. So that's the first rule in general. Hopefully that makes some sense to us of how both God and the enemy, they're opposite of each other. But what if we're on the path now of following God? That's what the second rule is about, those following God. What will the enemy do in this case? St. Ignatius says, in persons who are going on intensely purifying their sins and rising from good to better in the service of our God and Lord, it is proper to the evil spirit to bite, sadden, place obstacles, disquieting with false reasons, so that the person may not go forward. So if you begin to see here, suddenly, if we're on the path following God, what the enemy does, his tactic is now switched, right? If we're on the right path, he's going to make us feel good about it. But if we're on the wrong path, he is going to try desperately to get us off that path, right? He is going to try to throw us off from, he says he'll bite, right? Often through negative thoughts, especially about our worth, our abilities, right? There's no way. Give up. You're never going to do it, right? Sadden. He wants to rob us of any joy that God might give. Instead, this kind of sense of heaviness, loneliness, being by myself. I'm all alone. This is way too hard. Obstacles. Trying to portray our effort as much too difficult. It's unsustainable. Sure, you might be able to do it for a little bit of time, after that retreat and that one experience, but you're never going to make it. So try placing obstacles or other things going on in our life. We're just going to fail. And then false reasons, he says, trying to discourage us with reasons that at first they appear to make sense. In some sense they make sense, but he's the father of lies, right? There's always a kernel of truth, but he distorts it. Ultimately, it's not true. So things like, you're not good enough. Do you really think God loves you? You can't change. Those kinds of things are lies from the enemy, and we should reject them. And what these things are going to be called, St. Ignatius in Coming Up rules, these are spiritual desolations. Spiritual desolations. And so we'll go into a lot more detail when we get to the fourth rule about what these can look like. That way we can recognize them for what they are. So then, the second rule, the second part of it, is what is God going to do? What is the good spirit doing? If we're on that path following God, what is he going to do? What's God going to do there? And persons going from good to better in the service of God, it's proper to the good spirit to give courage and strength, consolations, tears, inspirations, and quiet, easing and taking away all obstacles, so that the person may go forward in doing good. So you notice God, because we're on the right path, he wants to keep us on that path, right? He's going to give us the grace we need to be able to stay upon that, right? So he's going to give, things like, I'm with you always. You can do all things through him who strengthens me. You are my beloved son or daughter. Consoling thoughts that can come from God, we want to pay attention to those. So notice that when we're following God, he wants to keep us going. And so he may allow us to experience those desolation experiences from the enemy, but they don't come from him. He gives consolation, not desolation. But he can allow desolation. He permits it. And we'll find in later rules there's some reasons why he permits it, why he allows us to go through those experiences. And we'll get more into the details of what these consolations could look like. Because they're very, there's a whole variety of them, the way they could look like. And he talks about that in the third rule, which we're not going to cover tonight. So we'll come back to that. Great example, just to illustrate this, from St. Augustine, classic example of the two paths. When he was young, he went off to study in the big city, like college basically. He said he had a longing for evil things. His imagination was filled with sensual delights, right? He's on the path away from God. That's what the enemy's doing, right? Trying to make him feel good. And that dominated his life for the next 20 years. Promiscuity, he had a child out of wedlock, he was pursuing all sorts of strange religions and philosophical ideas, but there was a weariness within him. He was anxious, he was unsatisfied. All was not right. God was pursuing him, right? That was that biting of the conscience from the Lord. And then when he began to consider returning to the faith and changing his life around, that's when the enemy, so now he's starting to go this direction towards following the Lord, the enemy increased the draw to the worldly pleasures, right? Saddened him about ever having to change. So there's two things happening at once. Trying to make him feel good about the path he's on, but since Augustine's fighting against it, he's also making him feel like there's no way you're going to be able to make it. What makes you think you could possibly, change your life? You're too weak. And so he's struggling with his attachments to his vices, the inability to change on his own. But God would then give him an experience of consolations. Look at the others who did it. They were no stronger than you. Trust in God. As he did it in them, he can do it in you. He won't let you down. And so there's this important moment of conversion in which his life is turned around. And we can see examples of this too if you look at the various stories in the scriptures. You could apply, this as well. Adam and Eve, for example. After God created Adam and Eve, they're on this pathway following God, right? There's no sin yet. They're following the Lord. So what do we expect the enemy to do in that case? Well, he's going to sadden them. He's going to bring doubts, false reasons to get them off track. And that's precisely what he does. The serpent says, did God really tell you can't eat from any of the trees in the garden? Right? He's putting doubt in their mind. He's disturbing, taking away their peace, to try to question whether God really loves them. God knows that the moment you eat of the tree, you'll be like gods, right? He's giving them lies. He's feeding them things that are only half-truths, right? And unfortunately, if they'd have been following these rules, they should reject those things that come at them, right? But unfortunately, they're going to listen to them, and that leads them to fall. They don't we'll learn later that some of the things we should do when we're in that times of attack from the enemy is we should turn more in prayer to the Lord. That was one of the things they didn't do. They didn't reach out to God for help. And unfortunately, they turn away, and then when they sin, then they experience that bite, that sting of their conscience, right, where they experience shame for having turned away from the Lord. Jesus himself could apply the rules to him when he was tempted by the enemy, right? Obviously, Jesus is going from good to better. So when the enemy tries to come, he once again brings doubt and disquiet. Why do you need to fast? You're hungry. Turn these rocks into bread. But unlike Adam and Eve, we see what Jesus does properly. He immediately rejects the temptation, and he goes to what he knows is true, right? To the sacred scriptures. These are the words of my Father. I know this to be true. Man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God, right? This is what's true. Those things are lies. He's fighting against it. He's rejecting those temptations. And that's what he does in all three of those temptations. And that's what we should do as well when the enemy's disquiet comes into our soul to reject them. So these first two rules with the next ones, they're going to help us to grow in our faith, in love of God, in our fruitfulness of our service within the church and our families. And we begin to recognize, to discern the tactics of when the good Spirit's at work, when it's the enemy at work. So be attentive. Name the spirit that happens. Reject those discouraging thoughts from the enemy. Don't give up. Sometimes when we don't respond well to those kinds of desolation, we settle for less. We live with this heaviness within us. But there's a path of freedom from this, from desolation. And that's what we'll find when we apply these rules. So next Sunday, Sparks, we'll continue with the third rule, and we'll talk and try to recognize better what consolation looks like.